Welcome to the inaugural, the first Big Stuff podcast. Kevin Brockway from CNHI Indiana with Elton Hayes from CNHI Sports Pennsylvania. It's basketball time. Elton, it sneaks up on us beginning in November. Every year they move the schedule earlier, and it's kind of crazy that we're balancing basketball and football at the same time. This month we're probably the two hardest working sports writers in America right now, but a lot of excitement, for this time of year for college basketball. Tomorrow's the Champions Classic, and certainly in the Big Ten, when you have the preseason number one team in Michigan State, I think there's a lot of hope this year, as in previous years, that this conference, will make a lot of noise in March.
Well, it's deep. I mean, when you get a team like Michigan State leading the pack, and like our guest was kind of saying, before the injury, it was kind of unanimous. It definitely puts a little bit of pressure on the conference. The conference is still seeking its first national championship in 19 years, which is crazy to think about. And I believe in the previous NBA draft, there were only two first-round selections for the Big Ten. But it's a deep conference, from top to bottom. It's got a lot of good teams. The top is really heavy with teams like Maryland, Ohio State, Michigan. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes up this year.
Yeah, and obviously a new face in Michigan with Juwan Howard as the head coach, John Beilein going to the NBA. That's certainly going to have an impact. And Juwan Howard has brought in Phil Martelli, the longtime St. Joe's coach, to kind of help him out on the bench, which is interesting. And certainly Purdue with Matt Painter, also another team that loses the Big Ten's leading scorer, Carson Edwards. So he's going to have to, find some offense to replace them. But they're preseason top 23. They're in the mix. So I think this league, it's deep, it's physical. It always is. That's always been my perception. And, as you know, I've covered college basketball for a long time at the University of Florida. I covered the Gators, was fortunate enough to cover the back-to-back national championship teams with, Joakim Noah, Al Horford, and Corey Brewer, Torian Green. So the outsider perception I always had from the SEC of the Big Ten is physical, fundamentally sound, gym rats, a bunch of guys that, basketball is a winter sport, obviously. Yeah. So it's, you have a lot of guys in the gym, a lot of really great shooting. And I think we're going to see that throughout the season from all 14 teams.
I think we are. And, kind of circling back to your Matt Painter, just looking at what he's done at Purdue. He's been there since 2005. He's won over 320 games. I believe his teams have made the tournament the last 5 years in a row. Last year they were in the Elite Eight. Carson Edwards was a big part of that. But he's a guy that I don't think really gets that much love, considering his body of work. And he's a winner. He does well, and I just wanted to kind of highlight him and mention his accomplishments. And he kind of seems to fly a bit under the radar nationally, in my opinion.
And what he does is he adapts to his personnel, and he adapts to the times a little bit too. It's really interesting. When I started on the beat in March, one of the first stories I did on the beat was about Andrew McClatchy. Now, who's Andrew McClatchy? He is the analytics coach at Purdue. The fact that, Carson Edwards was bombing up threes like crazy last year was no accident. It was just a number situation and adapting to his personnel, which is, threes beat twos, and you got to take them to make them. And that's what Purdue did. And Ryan Klein, Carson Edwards, and they did that. And they got all the way to the Elite Eight doing that. Now they had, Matt Harms inside. They had balance. Joe Eastern, who was a great defender. And this year they're not going to have that shooting, but they might have to rely a little more on the defensive end of the floor.
Yes, no, it's going to be fun to watch them. They're always one of those exciting teams, in the Big Ten.
So Michigan State opens up against Kentucky tomorrow in the Champions Classic. A lot of polls preseason 1 versus preseason 2.
Yeah.
Kentucky, we know, has tremendous talent, and Michigan State is going to be without Joshua Langford for a while, at least until January. Possibility of maybe him redshirting this season. There have been some reports, but I still think this is a pretty deep Michigan State team led by Cassius Winston, the point guard, and obviously Xavier Tillman, the big man, the junior. I mean, you're talking about two preseason All-Americans I still think they're going to be fine, and that they're going to be the team to beat in this league.
Yeah, it's an interesting stat. Apparently, this is the second time in Division I history that the top two teams in the AP Top 25 will play each other in the season. So I thought that was really interesting. But no, the loss of Josh Langford definitely at depth. He's definitely one of the conferences and one of the country's most talented players. But they've got guys like Kyle Keither. I know he has a broken nose, but he's going to play. Or he's expected to play. Kyle Ahrens and Rocket Watts. I got to throw Rocket Watts in there right now for the preseason Big Ten Name of the Year. But Michigan State is definitely the class of the conference. This is one of those I guess twice in a lifetime matchups given that history there. And I'm excited to watch that one in Madison Square Garden tomorrow night.
Yeah, Rocket Watts, he's got to be a guy that's fast with the ball in his hands, right? With a name like that, you would think anyway.
Dynamic player, dynamic name.
Yeah, that's definitely the old name. Indiana here is going to be interesting to see. You lose Romeo Langford, who was one of the best freshmen in the Big Ten, if not the country last year. He goes in the first round, 14th through Celtics. You lose Juwan Morgan. There's some concerns right now in Archie Miller's rebuilding project here. It's year 3. He does have, an incoming McDonald's All-American in Trace Jackson Davis. He's got Devontae Green back, a senior. He's a little hobbled early in the season with a hamstring issue. But I think the fan base here is wondering, when is it going to come back? They haven't been to a Final Four since 2002. They haven't won a national title since 1987. There's a lot of concern here in the Hoosier State. It's obviously an iconic brand, Indiana basketball, but it'll be interesting to see how they kind of develop as the season goes on.
No, it will. You mentioned year 3 being big for him, and you take over a program like Indiana. Those come with lofty expectations. Last year they were 19-16, 8-12 in the Big Ten. They returned a number of starting players in Al Durham, Justin Smith, Bob Canuse, but the question is, will they be able to make that jump forward? Losing a guy like Romeo Langford will definitely hurt and make that that path a lot more difficult. But this is Indiana, the program that is a blue blood. It's filled with good players, like good recruiting classes come through there under Archie Miller's tenure. So it's going to be interesting to see where they fit in terms of tiers of the Big Ten Conference and those teams.
Yeah, and certainly there could be a few surprise teams at Illinois and the team that you cover, Penn State, with Coach Patrick Chambers there, with Lamar Stevens coming back. Well, what's the buzz like in Happy Valley for basketball? We know that James Franklin obviously has the football program rolling, but what's the excitement level for basketball there heading into November?
I tell you, it was up the notch with Lamar Stevens' return to Happy Valley. A lot of people, including Pat Chambers, which I know you were able to speak with him at Big Ten Media Days, was very happy. He's a guy who led the team in scoring last year with 19.9 points per game, rebounds per game 7.7. He also logged a team high, for minutes with 1,180. So there he mentioned he was working on his 3-point percentage, becoming a better playmaker over the offseason. But people are excited. Losing a guy like Josh Reese to the NBA definitely is going to hurt. Also losing Rasir Bolton to Iowa State. He transferred in the offseason. He was the second leading scorer last year with 11.6 points per game. But they've got some guys who can really step in there and fill in fill in those absences. Miles Dredd had a very good freshman campaign last year. He's a guard. They also returned junior guard Zamari Wheeler and senior forward Mike Watkins. So, they're excited. This is a team that, under Pat Chambers, won the NIT 2 years ago, posted, I believe, 25 or 28 wins in winning the NIT, and a lot of people are hoping that the Stevens return and the depth that they have this year, which might be the most that Pat Chambers has had in his 9 years in Happy Valley, will be enough to get them over that hump.
Yeah, and, in discussing maybe some of the challengers to the Big Ten title race to Michigan State, we have to begin with Maryland as well. Mark Turgeon, he's got Anthony Cowan coming back. He's got Jalen Smith. Elton, certainly this is a team that's, preseason number 7. They're a team that could, perhaps with the injury news to Joshua Langford, make Michigan State a little nervous. They
can. One thing they have is really good guards and a lot of it this year. Well, it'll be interesting to see how they transition from the Bruno Fernando era. He was a huge part of that success last year. Not having him's going to hurt, but you have a guy like, Anthony Cowan Jr., Aaron Wiggins, who was I believe he was a sophomore this year, who played a big role last year. One of the things is Maryland wants to take that next level, it's going to have to cut down on the turnovers. They have a really high turnover ratio. And, Pergin, while he's kind of, kept Maryland's program above above the fray there. It hasn't really done anything to turn that corner. I'm not saying that I'm expecting him to put up Gary Williams numbers, but he didn't inherit a good program with a lot of tradition-rich program, and it's about time for him in his ninth year to kind of figure that next level. One Sweet 16 appearance in 8 seasons isn't going to cut it, but if there's a year for him to really do it, I believe this is it with the amount of depth and the talent that they have in Maryland.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Elton, you and I, when we were growing up, we associate Maryland with the ACC, and it's been the
Duke rivalries, and UGA. Yeah.
Lefty Drizel. I mean, it's amazing to think that, they've made this transition into the league, but it just tells you the depth and the talent that this league has. And, I know you alluded to no national title since 2000, but, it's not like they've been not knocking on the door since then. They've had a number of teams that have played for the national title. I mean, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
Wisconsin in 2015, Michigan under Beeline twice this decade. So maybe this is the year that Michigan State cuts down the nets.
They seem primed. I mean, on paper, they have to be the favorite. And looking at the preseason standings and these a lot of these previews, everyone seems to think the same. That the injury will hurt them, but Cassius Winston is just a phenomenal player, and he can mask a lot of those deficiencies while they figure out what's going on with Langford. But I think if there's a year to do it, Michigan State and Izzo are the people to do so.
All right, and so coming up, we will have our first guest on the First Big Ten podcast, and he's a great one, Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News. This is Kevin Brockway from CNHI Sports Indiana with Elton Hayes from CNHI Sports Pennsylvania. Welcome to our inaugural Big Stuff podcast. Kevin Brockway from CNHI Sports Indiana with Elton Hayes from CNHI Sports Pennsylvania. And we have a special guest, one of the best college, if not the best college basketball writer in the country. He's a USBWA Hall of Famer. He's covered college basketball for a long time for the Sporting News. Mike DeCourcy, and he is in New York for the Champions Classic as well, for the Michigan State-Kentucky matchup and Duke, Kansas. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Kevin, it's great to be with you and Elton. I'm honored that you would include me on your inaugural show.
Yes,
Thanks for doing
that. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Mike and I go back a long way. As you know, I used to cover the Florida Gators for many years, and now in beautiful Hoosier country in Indiana. But Mike, let's get right to Michigan State. Preseason number 1 in the country. Obviously, news this week with Joshua Langford's status. He's going to be out until at least January. There's possible talk of him even redshirting. I recently read in the Lansing State Journal. But how do you think this impacts Michigan State in the short term, beginning with tomorrow night's matchup against Kentucky?
Well, I really don't think it's about the short term for Michigan State. If you said, okay, here's the deal, Joshua Langford's going to miss December and November, and then in January he's going to be 100%, and nothing else is going to go wrong with that foot. Now, you obviously couldn't guarantee somebody not going to hit him in the head or whatever, but if you said nothing else is going wrong with that foot from January, February, March, and maybe April, it doesn't affect them at all. I mean, but that's not the case. The case is that they don't know whether or not he'll be ready to go in January. So you have to look at a Michigan State team that was, and I went through this back about a month ago, trying to find out, okay, who's everybody picking back, basically to write the lead for our pick, which was going to be Michigan State. I want to know, well, who else has been picked by anyone? And I went through Athlon, Lindy's, Blue Ribbon. I knew what AP would do at the time, and they ultimately did. CBS, NBC, ESPN, every single outlet that I could find that does a preseason top 25 picked Michigan State. They were about as close to unanimous, if they weren't unanimous, as a preseason number one could be in a sport as disparate as college basketball is. And now, if you took that poll again today, or every single outlet sat down and decided to redo their rankings because of this injury, you might have a lot of different answers. Michigan State's not a clear, sure thing anymore. And again, as regards this sport, almost no one ever is a clear, sure thing. But they were an easy pick. It was hard to make a case for someone else when you looked at Michigan State and what they had. It was hard to pick apart Michigan State's case. But now you put them in a position where, who is their two guard? Is it Rocket Watts, the freshman, which makes them very small as a team? Is it Gabe Brown, the sophomore, who did some nice things a year ago, but there's some questions about him defensively? What do you do? Do you do Arns and go in that direction, Kyle Arns, and say, okay, we're going to be tougher and he can make a shot, but then you're not very dynamic. I mean, Kyle's a terrific player, but if he's your shooting guard, he's a great, an absolutely elite sixth man. But is he dynamic enough to be 28 to 30 minutes a night as your starting shooting guard? So there are lots of questions about them. And I don't know if it puts the Big Ten in play. I mean, somebody's going to have to rise to that occasion. Maryland, Purdue, Ohio State, Wisconsin, somebody. But it certainly makes Michigan State less of a clear favorite nationally.
Could you see an opportunity for Kentucky to knock them off tomorrow? And if so, what would have to happen in that case?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to remember, and I think the important thing is to remember that what happens tomorrow night, Tuesday night at Madison Square Garden, is an important chip for whoever the winners are to gain. If you get that, you get a nice win on your resume that stands up, as the NCAA has told us, the selection committee has told us over the years. That win means just as much tomorrow as it would if it were on March 1st. But it doesn't necessarily make a clear declaration about anybody's direction, because Kentucky came out a year ago in this deal and got absolutely obliterated. I mean, it was a joke, and they'll tell you it was a bad joke. They got humiliated. I can't even remember what the final score was, but it literally could have been 60. And Duke was terrific that night. And Kentucky wound up becoming a great team and missing the Final Four by a bucket, basically the same as Duke wound up. And we came out a year ago, and Quentin Grimes shot like he was walking into the lottery the next day. And everybody thought that he was an absolute revelation that night. And then he didn't make another shot for a month. So can Kentucky win tomorrow night? Sure. They've got to play. They've got to play consistently. They got to play together. They need good play out of their front court, and they've had some injury problems there. Nothing major, but enough to affect their early season preparation. Nick Richards has been limited a little bit. So there's a lot that could happen tomorrow night. But one thing I would caution everybody about is don't overreact to what you're seeing, positively or negatively, because last year taught us the directions in both the lessons in both of those directions, that you can't be sure that what you're seeing on November 5th is going to hold up even to November 30th.
Hey, this is Elton with CNHI Pennsylvania. Once again, thanks for joining us. I know you are getting ready to get started on your busy time of the year. Here at Penn State, a lot of people were excited this offseason to learn of Lamar Stevens' return. Penn State enters its ninth year under Pat Chambers. The Nittany Lions were 14-18 last year. We're tied for 10th of the Big Ten, but they're also 2 years removed from a NIT championship and 27 wins. The Nittany Lions returned some good depth in, sophomore guard Miles Dredd, junior guard Jamari Wheeler, and senior forward Mike Watkins. The Big Ten is always deep. Nothing's ever given in that conference. Do you feel that this might just be Penn State's year with Stevens' return and the amount of depth that it has to make a realistic run in the tournament?
Oh, well, I mean, first I got to get to the tournament.
The Big Ten tournament.
Well, I think that they can have a successful season, but I would put them in a group of 6, 7, 8 teams. Indiana is one of those as well, that needs to have things go right, including scheduling. And I'll admit I have not looked at Penn State's schedule at this point. I mean, a year ago, Illinois, maybe somebody would have put them in that list, probably at the bottom of that list if there was such a list. But Illinois would have been in that list, and they probably were good enough to be successful, but their schedule was absolutely mountainous, and they couldn't climb it. They played well in some games, and they just kept falling off the edge and rolling back down, and they never were able to be successful. And then they got into Big Ten play, and the Big Ten was really tremendous last year, depth-wise. At the top, we saw with Michigan State and Michigan, and so they just couldn't get there. What has to happen, in addition to the schedule being right, is that they have to get the right play at point guard. Losing Rasheer Bolton takes a talent out of the mix. He's a very capable player from the standpoint of, handle, pass, shoot. He can do those things. He wasn't a great defender, but I don't know that it necessarily doesn't maybe add a little bit in terms of chemistry. Jamari Wheeler is not a great point guard, but he's a really good defensive point guard, and I think he can. If you run your offense properly, you run it through Lamar, and I talked to Lamar, as a matter of fact, at Big Ten Media Day, and he mentioned the possibility of him, being somewhat of a facilitator in addition to being a target, being someone who helps set up his teammates as well. And I think that's a realistic option for them. So they have to have a well-designed offense to go with what's usually been a pretty stout defense. But if that happens, then they can be successful. The thing that bothers me or worries me, or whatever verb you want to use with Penn State, is that in Pat's time there, I mean, look over the Ken Pom numbers for Penn State. Offensively, they're never where they need to be. Or maybe I should say rarely. I think the NIT team had a pretty successful offense from a efficiency standpoint, but most of the time they're way below what would be NCAA standard. Well, now they've got guys in Miles Dredd and obviously Mike Watkins if he's healthy and out there, and of course Lamar. They've got guys who can finish, who can score. So they've got to create an offensive structure that accentuates those players and not forces them to be great just for the offense to be functional.
Okay. Sticking in within the Big Ten, Maryland. Another coach who's going to enter his ninth year, Mark Turgeon. I believe they've been to one Sweet 16 in his 8 years there. They lost a lot with Bruno Fernando last year, 13.6 points per game and 10.6 rebounds. But they also return a lot with Anthony Cowell and Jalen Smith. Is this the year? Do you think that Turgeon, if he doesn't really live up to expectations this year and get them past that second round of the tournament, do you think he starts to feel some heat there in College Park?
I'm not a hot seat guy. I don't really like that mechanism. I've never believed in it. Some of my colleagues in the media will write that. I've been able to say in my position at Sporting News, I won't do those. And I just don't believe that it's up to the schools to decide whether or not their coach works. What I can say about Maryland is that in Mark's time there, what they haven't really done yet is do something that we haven't expected. Yeah. I thought last year they had a nice year, a very nice year, and perhaps if they had made one more defensive stop and not given up a layup at the end of their game against LSU and made the Sweet 16, we'd have said, that was kind of unexpected. I mean, they're playing a lot of freshmen. They obviously had a veteran point guard and an NBA big man, but they were playing a lot of freshmen a year ago. I think that would have qualified as unexpected, or maybe made a run in the Big Ten tournament. That hasn't been, their Big Ten tournament record hasn't been very good. So if they had done that, maybe they would have. So I guess now, the expectations are a little higher. So maybe this year they don't even need to do something unexpected, but it would be good for them if they did something that was expected. And a lot of people have them in or around the top 10, which is basically a Sweet 16 level season. A season that would end, that would end with them being seated, around a 3, perhaps. They've not done that too consistently under Mark. I think Mark does a nice job, but I'd like to see his guys show the kind of grit from time to time that you see in other Big Ten schools. And not every Big Ten school always overachieves. I mean, Michigan a year ago under John Beilein, it had a really terrific season, but was unable to win the biggest games. They lost 3 times to Michigan State. They lost in the Sweet 16 against Texas Tech and lost pretty badly. So even the greatest coaches don't always deliver that, and it doesn't always live up to what they want. But I think we would like to see from Maryland this year them doing it at least once or twice, doing something that we haven't seen much from them before.
Mike, Purdue, obviously, a really terrific year last year under, Matt Painter, but you lose Carson Edwards, you lose Ryan Klein, you lose a lot of shooting. I'm hearing a lot of really good things about Sasha Stefanovic there in practices, but how do they compensate offensively with the loss of those two, or do you see this as a team that's going to have to do it at the defensive end?
Well, it's going to start at the defensive end because, they've got one of the terrific point guard defenders in the country. And it also, you also look at it and you say, and you've got the two big guys. Matt Harms is an unbelievable post defender with his ability to block shots and recover quickly and close gaps that seem to be there, that players believe are there, and then all of a sudden they're getting their shot swatted, and then maybe by the second 10 minutes or the second half, they're thinking about what Harms can do. So that's something that Purdue can do defensively. But from the offensive standpoint, there are the questions of can they create space if they're playing Matt Harms and Travion Williams together. Matt Painter is as I'm trying to look. Creative is one word, but it's flexible is the word I'm looking for. He can say, okay, this is what my team needs to be this year, and then figure out a way for it to be that. Better than most coaches, better than pretty much any coach. He can do that. Some coaches can look at their system and say, okay, this guy, and this guy fit perfectly. Let's go get those guys, or the closest thing we can get to those guys, and then let's play that way, and then we'll win. And that there are some coaches who are really good at that. Matt's one of the best at saying, this is who we can get. They're all good players. Now let's go figure out a way to win with them. And so this year he's got those two big guys, and he's got to find a way to create space for Travion Williams underneath while having Matt Harms on the floor. If I'm a defensive team, why do I not just double off of Matt Harms if Travion gets the ball? Now Travion's a very good passer, so he can defeat those double teams at times. But there is the problem of even getting the ball to him in the first place if the lane is crowded. So that's his first problem offensively. The second problem, you mentioned it, do they have enough shooting? Stefanovic, every report is scrimmages, et cetera, that he's been really good making shots. And I think the one thing that people don't always understand about shooters is, a guy gets into a game, for 12 minutes a game because he's behind Carson Edwards and Klein, and so he gets maybe 1-2 shots a game, and if he misses those 2 shots, he's 0 for 2, and he's shooting 0-0-0, and then you look at the end of the year, and he's maybe shot 3-25 from 3, and you think, well, he must not be a shooter. Well, and then you put him out there, and he's getting 4 or 5 shots a game, and he's making 2-3 of those, and now he's a 40% shooter. There's a huge difference. And so I think Stefanovic can be that shooter. The question for Purdue then as well is, can Stefanovic be the kind of defender that doesn't frustrate Matt to the point where he thinks about taking him out of games for that reason?
It's always about the plus minus. Finally, Mike, Indiana, we knew this was going to be a hard job 3 years ago when Archie Miller took it. You know, obviously this year you lose Romeo Langford as a freshman to the NBA draft. To the Celtics, you lose Juwan Howard, your top two scorers. He seems to think that a little more depth, a little more experience this year, some older guys can help compensate for that. What's your view, and can they make a realistic jump in the Big Ten standings?
Well, you know, when I look at Indiana, what worries me about Indiana is that the guys that are supposed to be your answers are still questions. Now, they may not be by the end of the year. They may not be by the end of the month. But until Justin Smith goes out there and plays with great enthusiasm and intensity for 30 minutes a night, say, for 15, 20 games, my default thought about Justin Smith is that we're going to see the inconsistency we saw a year ago. I mean, that's because he's been that player for 3 years now, 2 years. He's been that guy for 2 solid years. Now, I mean, maybe he just needed maturity and all that, experience. But that's the thing that in the preseason you look at and you worry about. And the same is true of Devontae Green, a guy who's now in his 4th year, but who has been offensively very inconsistent. I don't think effort's been as inconsistent with him as just sometimes execution mistakes, those sorts of things. At times he's been brilliant. I mean, you look back at the Ohio State game that decided their tournament fate. He did maybe 4 things that you're like, why? After 30 games, are you still doing this? And then he made maybe 5 plays that you're like, holy cow, what he can be when he's good. And so you can't have those first 4 plays on a consistent nightly basis with a senior guard who's as important to your team as this. So that's my first concern with Indiana. If those guys are good players this year, then the fact that they have talent like Trace Jackson-Davis developing, and the fact that they have the depth that you're talking about, and they have a kind of a reliable shooter like Al Durham, and you have 2 bigs who can really play for anybody. I mean, as long as they're healthy, Deron Davis and Joey Brunk give you size, strength. You can play them together if you want to try. You can just you can go 20-20 with them, or play the hot guy and go 25-15, whatever. You can do a lot with those 2 guys, but it all comes back to me to Devontae and Justin being consistent players in terms of execution, effort, and commitment. And if they are those, then Indiana has a chance again to be on the top of that list that I talked about. That the list of teams that have questions, but also could perhaps have the answers.
Mike, we greatly appreciate it. Have a slice of raised pizza for me in New York, okay?
I'll try to do that.
Enjoy the Garden and enjoy, some great college basketball tomorrow all season long.
Appreciate your time, Mike.
Me. Appreciate it.
All right, that's Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News. This is Kevin Brockway and Elton Hayes from the Big Stuff Podcast.